Hello everyone, Professor Sexton here with our video lecture on poetic terminology. Let me begin by first sharing the document that's poetic terminology that you'll be able to find in course documents on the Blackboard page. So you should be able to see that. Excellent. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do for this video lecture. I'm just going to go through and mention and talk about a few of these. I won't discuss all of them, but then also in the forthcoming lectures that you'll have on the different poems that we're reading, such as those Winter Sundays or My Papa's Waltz, I'll begin to use these terminologies more there. And so what you'll want to do is you'll want to watch this video lecture, read this document, and then as you're reading those poems, also watching those video lectures on those poems, you want to kind of toggle back to this document. So then all of this can start to make sense to you. So one of the first things that I want to talk to you about is the difference between a subject and a theme. So for a poem, a subject is the topic of that poem, but the theme is what that poem says about that topic. So you want to make sure that you don't conflate these two together. Like for instance, the subject of a poem could be love, but love itself is not a theme. In order for it to be a theme, the poem has to say something about love. So if the poem says that love is great, then that is a theme, or that love should be cherished, then that is a theme, because then what happens is the theme is saying something about that subject. When you talk about paraphrasing, paraphrasing is putting the lines of a poem in your own words and in your own language. Because you'll see with poetry that oftentimes poets play around with syntax. Syntax, spelled Syntax, is just the word order that we use when we're speaking English sentences, or any sentences for that matter. And in terms of an English sentence, we normally begin with the subject, such as the dog, and then we have the verb barks. However, with poetry, sometimes a poet might invert the syntax. And so, for instance, take that sentence that we would normally say, the dog barks. The poet might say, barks the dog, which is not the way that we normally speak, but that is what can happen. So then when you were to paraphrase that, you might want to paraphrase that line that says, um, the bark um, the bark of the dog, you might want to paraphrase that to say the dog barks. Speaker is the person speaking the poem. And so you want to be very careful here not to conflate the speaker with the poet. Like, for instance, the poem Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden. The speaker of that poem is a son, a boy whose age is, debatable. But don't say that the speaker is Robert Hayden, because the speaker is that persona of the poem, which brings us to the next part. The persona is the character or the identity of the speaker. So just as I was just talking about Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays, the persona of that poem is a boy who, the poem doesn't tell us how old he is, but, he could be like 14 or 15, he might be 25, 26. A persona could be a young girl. So you need to figure out who the persona of the poem is. And oftentimes, that's debatable in the matter of interpretation. So it depends on how you're reading the poem. These next two lines and stanzas, lines are the individual line of a poem. And then if you have a group, kind of like similar to a paragraph, there will be a stanza. Enjambment is when a line of a poem doesn't end with a punctuation mark and it just runs into the next line. And so that means that when you read those lines, to read them, you can continue reading until you get to the punctuation mark. And I will explain this more when we get to an actual poem, and then it'll make more sense to that. Diction are the words that a poet decided to use, so it's word choice. So like, for instance, when you read My Papa's Waltz by Theodore Rettke or Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays, and those Winter Sundays, Hayden's uses the word father, whereas in Redkey, he uses papa. So there's a word choice, and then you have to think about it. What does the word papa imply? What does the word father imply? So think of that. Here's syntax, which we've already talked about. These are the ones, figurative language, that I'm not going to go over into much detail. But the figurative language is language used to distinguish between what is actually written and what is meant. So, such as thing as like a symbol, which may stand in for something else. Like, for instance, in poetry, a rose often stands for love. So that rose becomes a symbol for love. However, be careful, not everything is a symbol. Sometimes a rose is just a rose. So be careful of that. Irony, simile, metaphor, we'll talk about these things in more detail as we go through the poems. I'm not going to go through any more of those. I will talk about personification. Personification is when human characteristics are given to a non human object. So, for instance, if you read a poem and the poem reads, "The trees spoke to me." Well, trees don't speak. But that's personification because it's given human characteristics to a non human object. Allusion is when a poet makes an allusion to either an, people, places, or another literary work. Imagery is important. That is just simply the five senses: sight, sound, taste, smell, touch that the poem evokes. So sometimes when you're reading a poem, you can see things, or you hear things, or um, you might taste things, or you might smell things. And so that's imagery using. And tone is the verbal indication of the speaker attitude towards the poem subject. So, like for instance, let's go back to that notion where we were talking about love. The speaker's tone towards love could be one that is hateful or spiteful, or it could be one that's joyous or happy. Keep in mind, all of these things are up to interpretation. So it really depends on how you're reading it. So that's it for poetic terminology. I know that this was very brief, but as I said before, this is going to make more sense when we start talking about the poems and then we start using them. And what I will suggest that you do as you begin to read the poems is save the poetic terminology document on your desktop or print it out if you can. And then as you're reading the poem, move back and forth between the two of them. And then that way it will give you a better sense of how these terminologies are being used in the poem. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this very brief lesson on poetic terminology. Bye.